feel free to enter them in the chat, and you can go ahead and get those in while we're going around the call one more time. And that is, I just want to hear, just give me your best story, one memorable behind the scenes, just moment that people wouldn't expect in the process of writing these books. And Colin, you can start us off.
Well, I think I've been through a lot of the stories associated with the beginning of the Outward Odyssey. There are a lot of stories to tell, and off the top of my head, nothing really stands out because everything is extraordinary. Everything is wonderful. I've had fights with authors online and over the phone. I've had fights with the University of Nebraska Press. But the wonderful thing about it is that at the end of the day, the postman will arrive in my house with a package. There'll be a book in it, the next Outward Odyssey book. And I'll pick that up and I'll look at it with pride, not only because of my participation in it, the early participation, but because this is the work of somebody that I've contacted who has been through the process, through the information that I've divulged. I've encouraged them, and that is always the surprise for me, is to receive this package, to put it on my shelf, and to know that in a way this is a legacy. This is something, when I was sitting in school back in the other times, when I could not have envisaged writing a book or even writing an article. So it's something that, I guess, if you're talking about surprises, it's a surprise to me where the whole Outward Odyssey has progressed to. It's become a monolith. You've heard all of these authors saying they've written their book. It's published. Great. What am I going to write next? Be my guest. Come up with an idea. And John and Mel, Jay, Francis, David, Michelle, you've all been there. You've all had that enthusiasm. I'm still waiting for Michelle to come up with a second idea. So is there a surprise story that I can tell? It's a surprise based on the fact that this whole series has been so incredibly successful. Its longevity is amazing, and its future is somewhat assured. I continually wake up in the morning and think, this can't be my life. This can't be happening. I'm living in another world. I can't be living in a world where I've written books, where other people write books. I've encountered work with a major US publisher. It's totally amazing and surprising, and here I sit.
Thank you so much. Michelle, give us a quick behind-the-scenes story.
Well, God, there are so many. Every one of the interviews that I did was just so special. Sitting in an ice cream parlor with Neil Armstrong in the pouring rain, talking to Admiral Forrest Peterson, the guy who commanded the USS Enterprise and flew the X-15 and such like that, sitting in his kitchen when he's got a robe on covered with cat hair. I mean, things like that you don't expect. Going up to NASA at Edwards and being invited up on Christmas Day by X-15 pilot Milt Thompson and flight planner Jack Koff, and sitting in Milt's office, sharing stories, all of us eating brownies that I brought up that day to celebrate Christmas, and no, they were not those kind of brownies. But I think my absolute favorite story is probably the day that I got 17 X-15 guys together in one room and had them telling me stories and having the camera running and trying to catch all these people all around. And there was specifically one story that one guy started about how he went in one time and he found this really cool pipe that was just the right size that he needed. And so he pulled the pipe out, and he was going to work on his lunch hour at sawing it down to just the right length and all this stuff. It was a rocket motor that still had fuel in it, a solid propellant fuel, and he was cutting it with a saw. And you can imagine what came next. And yes, it did explode. It fired off. And it went around the hangar, and it bounced around the hangar and broke windows and everything else. But the way that it transpired with these 17 guys was that one guy started the story, and then another guy, well, yeah, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And they're running all around. And in the end, the guys are sitting there. It's like, it's so great that we're here today because we can keep each other honest. And just watching their reactions to being able to tell those kind of stories and to be able to tell those in the book, that's an amazing thing that I will never, ever forget.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Francis, what you got for us?
Well, of course, the best behind-the-scenes stories are the secret ones, are the ones that you don't tell and you never will tell. And I think that's part of the key, too, which is after a while, word gets around with all of these authors that you've done your research, you know your stuff, you're trusted. And once you're trusted and you're in a little group, things change. That happened a lot with the Apollo astronauts, which is mostly what I was doing, that these are people that got asked all their life, what was it like to walk on the moon? And it gets old. When you're asked every day about something for the next 40 years, you can imagine you're not going back to your original memory to think about this. You're like, let me tell you the same damn story. I'm sick of telling. But if word gets around that you're okay, things change. And there are moments to me that are priceless. I'm sitting in my office and I get a phone call. Will you hold the phone for Senator Glenn? Yeah, okay, I'll stay on the line for John Glenn to give me a phone call to clarify something I've asked him on a technical issue to clarify. Spent a day with Neil Armstrong, realized a day in Neil Armstrong's life is not worth walking on the moon for because of the constant insanity around that poor guy. There are insights like that you get. It's very hard to nail down, but when I read the question you wanted to ask us, my first thought was sitting in somebody's house who went to the moon but didn't walk on it. Al Worden of Apollo 15 got to spend 6 days around the moon, 3 of them totally on his own, as an ambassador for human experience, looking out on the side of the moon where the earth shine isn't reaching it, the sunshine isn't reaching it, it's totally dark apart from the sheen of the Milky Way and this sort of bite taken out of the universe, which is the darkness of the moon. The only way you can tell the moon is there is where the stars stop. And he's talking about something he's feeling in his gut at that moment as he's floating totally alone for 3 days, looking out at the universe. A what does this mean kind of thing. You don't necessarily get the answers in that moment, but 30 years later, sitting in a bathrobe in his house as he's kind of going through these experiences, you begin to get a sense of, we can write down technical stuff, we can imagine what it's like, but until we are literally the most remote person in humanity, before or since, further away from any other human beings in history, before or since, feeling what that feels like, to chronicle that, to get that down on paper from somebody who's since passed away, that to me is priceless. And I felt honored to be the conduit to get a story like that on paper, because it's only a very sliver of human history that people ever did that, and most of them have passed away already. And if we don't get that down on paper now, we will never get a first like that again. We're going to go back to the moon with your rocket, David, but they won't be the first. And there's something about the first that really gets into your DNA. So I'm honored to have been in the room for moments like that.
Amen. Jay, what you got for us?
There have been a lot of stories, David, a lot of them. I was a third of the way into my first book, and I had one of my interview subjects so upset with me that he wrote a 3-page complaint letter to the publisher, the executive director of the press, and I thought my career was over. I thought it was over before it started. Eventually, we worked everything out and got on the same page and ended up being good friends. You've probably heard that I got sued on that same book. That was certainly a bit of an adventure there. It's just, the personalities that you run into are just, they're just amazing people who are doing this work. one of my favorite stories is I was doing research at the JPL archives, and I had left a phone message for Rob Manning, who is one of the senior level engineers there, who was intimately involved in landing the rovers on the surface of Mars, all of them. And I'm just sitting there puttering away through these documents that are 40 years old. My phone rings, it's Rob, and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing right now?" "I'm just sitting here doing research." Well, let's go walking around. And 5 minutes later, Rob Manning is coming up to me, and I'm like, "You have nothing better to do than to walk." It's like, "Where should we go?" And Rob, if you don't know him, is a guy who only operates at 100 miles an hour. There's off and there's 100 miles an hour, and there's no needle that flows in between. And so he just starts walking, and he's like, "What do you want to see? Do you want to see the Mars Yard? Have you ever seen the Mars Yard?" I'm like, "No, I've never seen the Mars Yard." "You know, we have a spare rover there. Let's go see it." And, you know, and he's got like all the keys to the kingdom, and suddenly we're in there. And it's like, "Hey, great picture of you with the spare rover, Jay." "Yeah, Rob Manning took it, chief engineer." Just a crazy personality. If I had to pick one story, though, it would certainly have to come back to Van Allen. Is sitting in the office with James Van Allen in May of 2005, asking him about discovering that the radio signals from Sputnik 1 were definitely not coming from Earth. I still firmly believe that he was the first person to really confirm that the signal from Sputnik 1 was actually coming from orbit. And his office is like an episode of Hoarders. I mean, there's just crap everywhere. And the dude stands up, walks in a straight line over to a shelf, pulls out his notebook from October of 1957, flips it open to the page, and starts reading his notes from that night and how he cobbled together spare parts down in the hull of a scorching hot ship that he could like plug into the radio system on the ship and record this stuff onto the little needle on the graph, and then telling me about it. That would probably have to be my number one. The fact that he had at 91 just a razor sharp memory of this, and that he could walk directly to his notebook and read from it, really stands out strong for me.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. John, you got a story for us?
Well, I think the audience can probably pick up that most of our stories, the most memorable things involve the people that we were interviewing and working with. And if that tells you something about this group, is one thing, we'd probably happily trade places with any one of them to have some of the experiences that they had. So my story's similar to that. Mel and I don't live in the same part of the country, so we did all of our writing virtually. But we did get together one time in Washington, D.C., and we went to the Udvar-Hazy Museum there and had a couple of interesting experiences on that weekend. We're standing there looking up at the Space Shuttle Discovery, the real ship. We saw the instrument pointing system from the the Space Lab 2 missions, and we're looking at all this hardware, and my phone rings, and it's one of the manned spaceflight engineers, one of the Air Force engineers that was assigned to a classified mission. And he called me, and we had talked by email a little bit, but he was finally getting around to agreeing to talk to me and do an interview. And I'll never forget one of the questions he asked me as he was getting ready to hang up. He said, "Well, John, let me ask you, how do I know that you are who you say you are?" And it struck me when he said that I'll bet a lot of quacks come after these guys sometimes and ask silly questions. And he wanted to make sure I guess I wasn't one of those people. So I reassured him and gave him some references and things like that. And the interview went great, and he was a great help with the book. Not long after that, just randomly walking around the museum, we ran into Kathy Sullivan, who at the time was working on her, doing some research on her own book that's out now, Handprints on Hubble. I assume that's what she was working on. She said she was doing research there at the museum. So that was interesting running into her. And later that weekend, we went over to a barbecue place and had lunch with Eric Sundberg, who is another one of the manned spaceflight engineers. And Eric is a very professorial type of guy with a gray beard and not known for his being an extrovert at all. And I think we conveyed that in the book, but he was really excited sitting there talking to us about the things that he couldn't talk about yet. Francis alluded earlier to some of the secret things that are still around that they haven't released yet. And he was wide-eyed and waving his hands around and saying, we can't see that yet, but when you do one of these days, it's going to be wow, you know, and you're going to be amazed by it. So, you know, maybe sometime down the road, there's another part of that story to be told in the Outward Odyssey series. I sure hope so.